The war had entered a phase where endurance mattered as much as courage. Britain, scarred by years of bombing and isolation, carried the psychological weight of survival rather than momentum. London still bore the wounds of the Blitz, and behind the defiant speeches lay a nation stretched thin, dependent on sea lanes and hope. Victory felt possible but never guaranteed, and every strategic decision seemed to echo with the ghosts of earlier mistakes. Across the Atlantic, the United States was awakening into war with industrial fury and moral certainty. American shipyards roared, training camps multiplied, and planners spoke in terms of mass, speed, and overwhelming force. To them, the path forward appeared obvious: strike directly at Nazi-occupied France, open a second front, and bring Germany to its knees through sheer pressure. Delay felt like weakness, and caution felt dangerously close to paralysis. Winston Churchill stood between these two visions, burdened by memory and intuition forged in earlier conflicts. He remembered how enthusiasm had once carried Britain into catastrophe at Gallipoli, where bravery had collided with poor preparation. That failure had not left him timid, it had made him exacting. He no longer trusted plans that ignored geography, logistics, and the unforgiving arithmetic of casualties. As Allied meetings intensified, the atmosphere grew strained. Maps were spread across tables, arrows drawn boldly toward northern France, timelines proposed with optimistic confidence. American generals spoke of momentum and morale, arguing that delay only strengthened German defenses. Churchill listened carefully, aware that unity was as critical as strategy, yet unwilling to sacrifice judgment for harmony. Beneath the surface, Britain's military reality remained sobering. The army had escaped annihilation at Dunkirk but not humiliation. Equipment shortages lingered, training was uneven, and institutional confidence had yet to fully recover. The Luftwaffe, though battered, still possessed the capacity to devastate an exposed invasion force. An early landing in France, Churchill believed, could end the war in disaster rather than liberation. Churchill's opposition was not rooted in fear but in timing. He believed Germany must be weakened, distracted, and stretched before the Allies attempted a decisive blow. To strike too early against an enemy entrenched and expecting the attack would be to repeat the mistakes that history punished without mercy. Strategy, in his mind, was not about courage alone, but about patience guided by foresight. As discussions dragged on, impatience hardened into frustration. American leaders quietly questioned whether British caution masked declining strength or imperial self-interest. Churchill sensed the doubt, yet remained unmoved. He believed leadership sometimes required standing alone, even when allies demanded action for action's sake. By the end of these deliberations, it was clear that the alliance faced not merely a tactical disagreement, but a philosophical divide. The coming decision would test trust, redefine cooperation, and determine whether the Allies would march toward victory or stumble into catastrophe. Churchill's alternative vision emerged not as a compromise, but as a challenge to conventional thinking. Rather than confronting Germany at its strongest point, he proposed striking where Axis control was thinner and coordination weaker. North Africa, long viewed as a secondary theater, suddenly became central to his design for eventual victory. The proposal shocked American planners. To them, North Africa represented distance, distraction, and delay. It meant fighting through deserts and political ambiguity rather than confronting the enemy at the gates of Europe. Some suspected the plan was designed to preserve British imperial interests rather than accelerate the war's end. Churchill countered these suspicions with strategic clarity. Control of North Africa would secure the Mediterranean, protect vital shipping lanes, and expose the southern flank of Europe. It would force Germany to divert troops and resources away from France and the Eastern Front. Most importantly, it would allow Allied forces, especially inexperienced American units, to learn modern warfare without facing the full brutality of the Wehrmacht in northern France. The Mediterranean had always been central to Churchill's thinking. He saw it not as a peripheral sea, but as a corridor of power connecting continents. By dominating it, the Allies could dictate the tempo of the war, choosing when and where to strike rather than reacting to German initiative. North Africa was the key that unlocked that control. Behind the scenes, British planners moved swiftly. Amphibious operations were refined, logistics calculated across thousands of miles, and contingency plans drafted for political uncertainty. French Vichy forces controlled much of the region, their loyalty uncertain and their reaction unpredictable. Diplomacy and intelligence became as vital as artillery and armor. American skepticism persisted, yet preparation revealed the operation's immense value. Coordinating landings across multiple ports, synchronizing naval and air support, and managing coalition command structures provided lessons no exercise could replicate. The operation was becoming a rehearsal for something larger, whether the Americans liked it or not. Churchill knew the risks were immense. A failure in North Africa would embolden critics and fracture the alliance. Success, however, would validate his belief that indirect pressure could produce decisive results. He accepted the gamble because he believed the alternative, an early invasion of France, carried even greater danger. When Churchill finally issued the order, it was not with triumph but with sober resolve. He understood that history would judge him harshly if the plan failed. Yet he also understood that leadership demanded the courage to disappoint allies today in order to save lives tomorrow. The announcement of the North African operation sent ripples through Allied command structures. Fleets were reassigned, divisions rerouted, and timetables rewritten almost overnight. For many American officers, the decision felt like a strategic detour imposed upon them rather than chosen with them. Doubts surfaced quietly at first, then openly. Some feared the Allies were drifting into a prolonged Mediterranean war that would drain resources and delay liberation in Europe. Others worried that German defenses in France would only grow stronger while Allied forces fought far from the decisive front. Yet as preparations intensified, resistance gave way to realism. The sheer complexity of the operation revealed how unprepared the Allies truly were for a direct assault on France. Communication failures, logistical bottlenecks, and command rivalries emerged even before the first landing craft sailed. These weaknesses, exposed early, could now be corrected rather than punished with mass casualties. When Allied forces finally landed in North Africa, chaos reigned. Resistance varied wildly, confusion spread through command chains, and coordination was often imperfect. But amid the disorder, something crucial occurred. Allied forces survived, adapted, and learned. Mistakes were costly but not catastrophic. German reaction confirmed Churchill's instincts. Hitler hesitated, uncertain whether North Africa was a feint or the beginning of a larger Mediterranean campaign. That hesitation delayed reinforcements and allowed Allied forces to consolidate their positions. The Axis, for the first time, was being forced to react rather than dictate. American troops experienced modern war in its harshest form: logistics under fire, leadership tested, and confidence earned rather than assumed. British forces regained momentum, no longer defined by retreat but by coordinated advance. The alliance, strained by disagreement, began to harden into a functional war machine. The Mediterranean slowly shifted in Allied favor. Supply routes tightened around the Axis, air superiority grew, and strategic initiative began to change hands. None of this would have been possible without the controversial decision that had redirected the war's early course. Churchill watched these developments with guarded satisfaction. He knew the war was far from won and critics had not vanished. But the shock he had delivered to Allied expectations was transforming into something more valuable than consensus: preparation. The decision that once threatened unity was laying the foundation for future triumphs. What had seemed like hesitation was revealing itself as strategy, and the path toward Europe, longer than many wanted, was becoming far more certain. North Africa did not reward inexperience with mercy. The desert exposed every weakness in Allied doctrine, stripping away assumptions and replacing them with hard-earned knowledge. Supply lines stretched across hostile terrain, where a single delayed convoy could stall an entire offensive. Men learned quickly that victory depended not only on courage, but on fuel, water, spare parts, and the invisible machinery of logistics that Churchill had insisted could not be improvised under fire. American units, new to large-scale combat, encountered a ruthless enemy shaped by years of desert warfare. German commanders exploited Allied rigidity, striking with speed and withdrawing before decisive engagement. Early defeats bruised confidence and silenced illusions of easy triumph. Yet these failures became the crucible in which modern Allied command began to form, replacing theoretical warfare with adaptive thinking. British forces too were tested. Veterans of earlier desert campaigns found themselves adjusting to new coalition dynamics, where coordination mattered as much as experience. The necessity of joint planning forced habits to change, breaking down national silos that had long defined military culture. North Africa became less a battlefield and more a laboratory of coalition warfare. Churchill followed these developments with intense attention. Reports from the front were read not for reassurance, but for instruction. Each setback confirmed his belief that such lessons learned in France too early would have been catastrophic. The desert, brutal as it was, offered space to fail, recover, and evolve. Air power emerged as a decisive factor, reshaping Allied understanding of combined arms warfare. Control of the skies dictated movement on the ground, and coordination between air and land forces improved through trial and error. These innovations would later define Allied success in Europe, but they were forged here, amid dust and heat. Political complexities added another layer of strain. Negotiations with local authorities, shifting loyalties, and fragile alliances demanded diplomatic skill alongside military strength. Churchill had anticipated this, knowing that modern war blurred the line between battlefield and politics. Success required persuasion as much as force. As months passed, the character of Allied forces began to change. Command structures tightened, communication improved, and leadership adapted to reality rather than doctrine. Confidence returned, not the naive confidence of planners, but the earned confidence of soldiers who had survived, learned, and prevailed. The desert absorbed blood, but it also yielded knowledge. What emerged from North Africa was not just territorial gain, but a transformed alliance, more cautious, more capable, and far more dangerous to its enemies. With North Africa secured, the Mediterranean ceased to be a liability and became a weapon. Axis supply lines faltered as Allied naval and air dominance tightened its grip. Convoys that once moved freely now ran gauntlets of submarines, aircraft, and surface fleets. The strategic balance began to tilt, validating Churchill's belief that control of this region could reshape the entire war. Italy loomed ahead, vulnerable and politically unstable. Churchill viewed it as the logical continuation of pressure, a means to fracture the Axis from within. The invasion of Sicily and the subsequent campaign in Italy forced Germany to commit divisions desperately needed elsewhere. Each battalion sent south was one fewer guarding the French coast. American skepticism gradually softened as results accumulated. Victories replaced doubts and cooperation replaced suspicion. The alliance learned not only how to fight together, but how to plan together, aligning strategic objectives across continents. The very process Americans had once feared was forging a unified command philosophy. The Mediterranean campaigns were costly, grinding, and far from glamorous. Mountain warfare, fortified positions, and civilian suffering challenged morale. Yet every mile gained exacted a strategic toll on Germany, stretching its resources and exhausting its ability to respond decisively. Churchill understood the psychological impact as well. The Axis aura of inevitability cracked as territory fell and allies wavered. Italy's eventual collapse removed a pillar of Hitler's coalition, opening new fronts and exposing weaknesses long concealed by propaganda. Allied airfields moved closer to Germany's industrial heartland, increasing the intensity and effectiveness of bombing campaigns. These operations, coordinated across theaters, demonstrated the cumulative power of indirect strategy. Germany was being worn down not by a single blow, but by relentless pressure on every front. The lessons of North Africa echoed through these campaigns. Commanders who had once faltered now adapted swiftly, integrating intelligence, logistics, and maneuver with increasing sophistication. Mistakes still occurred, but they were fewer and their consequences less severe. What emerged was a sense of inevitability, not of quick victory but of sustained dominance. The Allies were no longer reacting to German moves, they were dictating the rhythm of the war. Churchill's controversial path was converging toward its ultimate purpose. By the time attention returned to Northern Europe, the strategic landscape had transformed. German forces, stretched thin across multiple fronts, no longer possessed the flexibility they once enjoyed. Coastal defenses in France remained formidable, but the enemy behind them was exhausted, pressured, and increasingly defensive. Allied planning for the cross-channel invasion resumed with renewed seriousness. This time it was grounded not in optimism but in experience. Amphibious doctrine had matured, command structures were unified, and coordination between air, sea, and land forces was refined through years of hard fighting. Churchill did not oppose the invasion now, he supported it fully. His earlier resistance had never been about avoidance but readiness. The moment he had feared in 1942 was now the moment he had prepared for. The difference lay in capability, not courage. American forces, once untested, now formed the backbone of Allied strength. They brought not only numbers but competence earned in Africa and Italy. British forces, seasoned and adaptable, complemented this power with experience and institutional memory. The alliance had become what it needed to be. Germany sensed the coming storm but lacked the means to prevent it. Resources were scarce, reserves limited, and strategic initiative lost. The diversion Churchill had ordered years earlier had succeeded beyond its immediate aims, reshaping the balance of power across Europe. The Atlantic Wall, though formidable on paper, masked a deeper weakness: the erosion of German confidence. Units stationed there were often understrength, poorly supplied, and uncertain of reinforcement. The psychological advantage had shifted decisively. As final preparations advanced, the earlier shock of Churchill's decision faded into perspective. What once appeared as hesitation now revealed itself as preparation, measured not in months but in survival and success. The road back to France had been long and costly, winding through deserts and mountains. Yet it delivered the Allies to the threshold of decisive action, not weakened by delay, but strengthened by design. As preparations for the great invasion intensified, the cost of waiting became clearer in human terms. Soldiers trained relentlessly, aware that every exercise was rehearsal for a moment that would define their lives. For many, the delay that once frustrated political leaders now felt like a shield, granting time to learn, to harden, and to understand the enemy they would soon face across the Channel. Factories worked without pause, producing landing craft, aircraft, tanks, and the endless stream of supplies required to sustain a modern army. This industrial surge was not spontaneous. It was the cumulative result of strategic breathing room created years earlier. Without North Africa and the Mediterranean campaigns, such preparation would have been compressed into chaos. Churchill observed this transformation with the perspective of a statesman shaped by failure as much as success. He knew that patience in war was often mistaken for indecision, yet history favored those who waited for advantage rather than rushing toward glory. The quiet months of planning were as decisive as any battle. Intelligence efforts deepened, weaving together resistance reports, aerial reconnaissance, and intercepted communications. Each detail refined the picture of German defenses, revealing strengths to avoid and weaknesses to exploit. The Allies no longer guessed at the enemy's disposition, they studied it methodically. Morale evolved in subtle ways. The sense of imminent sacrifice remained, but it was tempered by confidence in leadership and preparation. Soldiers understood that they were not being sent blindly into the unknown, but as part of a carefully constructed strategy shaped by hard lessons. Churchill's earlier defiance of Allied impatience now seemed distant, yet its legacy was everywhere. The structure of command, the integration of forces, and the emphasis on coordination all traced back to decisions made under pressure years before. What had once divided the alliance now defined its strength. The waiting also wore on Germany. Defensive preparations strained resources, and the constant expectation of invasion bred fatigue and uncertainty. Units were tied down, unable to maneuver freely, their effectiveness dulled by anticipation rather than action. Patience, often dismissed as passive, revealed itself as an active force. It shaped armies, economies, and expectations, preparing the ground for a moment when waiting would end in overwhelming motion. When the invasion finally came, it bore the imprint of every earlier choice. The beaches of Normandy were not merely a battlefield, but the culmination of years of deliberate restraint and preparation. The complexity of the operation reflected lessons learned far from France, in deserts and mountains where mistakes had been survivable. The landings were brutal, chaotic, and costly. No amount of planning could erase the reality of machine gun fire, rough seas, and shattered formations. Yet amid the carnage, the structure held. Units regrouped, command chains functioned, and momentum, once gained, was not lost. Air superiority, refined through Mediterranean campaigns, proved decisive. German movement was constrained, reinforcements delayed, and the battlefield shaped from above. The integration of air and ground forces demonstrated a maturity that had not existed at the war's outset. Logistics followed closely behind the assault, sustaining the advance with a precision born of experience. Artificial harbors, supply dumps, and transport networks operated under fire yet remained functional. These were the invisible victories that transformed landings into liberation. Churchill, though not commanding in the field, felt the weight of validation. The invasion he had once resisted succeeded not because it was inevitable, but because it was ready. The difference lay in preparation measured in years, not weeks. German resistance was fierce but fragmented. Command paralysis and resource shortages undermined defensive cohesion. The enemy fought with determination, yet without the strategic flexibility that might have turned the tide earlier. Normandy confirmed the ultimate logic of Churchill's controversial decision. The shock it had once delivered to Allied expectations had been absorbed, transformed, and returned as overwhelming force. As Allied armies pushed inland, the earlier debates faded into memory. Victory, once distant, began to feel attainable. The alliance that had struggled to agree on strategy now advanced with unified purpose, its strength rooted in shared experience rather than compromise alone. Churchill's decision was reassessed not as an act of obstruction, but as a moment of strategic courage. He had resisted pressure not to delay victory but to ensure it. History rarely records such restraint with drama, yet its impact was profound. American leaders, once skeptical, recognized the value of the path taken. The North African campaign had forged commanders, refined doctrine, and built trust. The war they now fought in France was fundamentally different from the one they might have fought in 1942. The cost of that earlier patience was measured in extended suffering across occupied Europe. This reality haunted Churchill, who understood that delay carried moral weight as well as strategic benefit. Yet he also knew that failure in France would have prolonged suffering even further. Germany's defeat unfolded with brutal inevitability. The Axis, worn down across multiple fronts, could no longer compensate for losses or adapt to Allied initiative. The indirect approach had become direct dominance. Churchill's legacy, shaped by both triumph and controversy, crystallized around this moment. He had trusted experience over impulse, memory over momentum. The shock he delivered to his allies had altered the course of the war. History's judgment, forged in hindsight, recognized the wisdom of restraint. The decision that once threatened unity had preserved it, and in doing so had helped secure victory. In the aftermath, Churchill reflected less on vindication than on responsibility. He understood that leadership was not defined by applause, but by choices made under uncertainty. The burden of those choices lingered long after the guns fell silent. The alliance emerged victorious but forever changed. Its success rested not on a single battle, but on a sequence of decisions that valued preparation over haste. Churchill's role in shaping that sequence remained central, if often understated. The war had proven that indirect paths could lead to decisive outcomes. Strategy, like history itself, rarely moved in straight lines. It curved through doubt, disagreement, and sacrifice before reaching its destination. For the soldiers who fought, the debates of earlier years mattered less than survival and victory. Yet their lives were shaped by those debates all the same. The desert battles they endured spared them worse fates on unready beaches. Churchill's decision stood as a reminder that unity does not require unanimity. Disagreement, when grounded in experience and foresight, can strengthen rather than weaken an alliance. The shock he delivered had forced the Allies to think, adapt, and grow. The echoes of that moment reached far beyond the war. Military doctrine, coalition warfare, and strategic planning all bore its imprint. Future leaders would study it as an example of patience under pressure. In the quiet after victory, the true measure of the decision became clear. It had not merely shocked the Allies, it had prepared them. And in preparation, it had helped turn the tide of history. As the Allied advance continued across Western Europe, it became increasingly clear that the outcome of the war had been shaped long before the first soldiers stepped onto the beaches of Normandy. The decisions taken years earlier had determined not only where the Allies fought but how they fought. What appeared sudden and overwhelming in 1944 was, in truth, the release of pressure carefully built over time. The German command struggled to respond to an enemy that no longer made fatal mistakes. Breakthroughs were exploited efficiently, supply lines were protected with discipline, and reserves were deployed with precision. These were not accidents of momentum, but habits formed through earlier campaigns where error had been punished and adaptation demanded. Churchill watched these developments with a sense of grim clarity. He knew that wars are often remembered by their climactic moments, not by the quiet decisions that made those moments survivable. His earlier insistence on preparation had allowed Allied forces to fight with cohesion rather than desperation. The Eastern Front, too, bore the indirect mark of his strategy. German divisions diverted to Africa and Italy had weakened resistance against the Soviet advance. Pressure applied in one theater echoed across others, compounding German losses and accelerating collapse. Allied unity matured into something resilient. Strategic disagreements still existed, but they were resolved within a shared framework shaped by experience. The alliance no longer feared debate, having learned that disagreement did not equal disloyalty. For the civilian populations of liberated territories, the methodical Allied advance brought stability rather than chaos. Towns were secured, supply restored, and governance re-established with an efficiency that reflected long preparation. Liberation was not perfect, but it was sustained. Victory, it became apparent, was not the result of a single gamble, but of a refusal to gamble recklessly. The war was being won not by surprise alone, but by inevitability crafted through patience. Yet even as success mounted, the cost of earlier delay could not be ignored. Occupied Europe had suffered under Nazi rule for years longer than many had hoped. Resistance fighters had endured reprisals, civilian starvation and terror. Churchill carried this knowledge heavily, aware that every postponed assault had a human price. Critics would later argue that earlier action might have shortened the war. Churchill did not dismiss these claims lightly. He understood the moral weight of inaction, yet he believed that a failed invasion would have condemned Europe to even greater suffering. The calculus of war offered no clean answers. Leaders were forced to choose between imperfect options, each carrying irreversible consequences. Churchill's choice favored preparation over immediacy, survival over spectacle. American leaders, reflecting after victory, acknowledged the complexity of that decision. The war they ultimately fought was one they were equipped to win. The war they might have fought earlier could have ended very differently. The soldiers who survived carried mixed emotions. Gratitude for preparation mingled with memories of loss. Many understood that the deserts of Africa had been a harsh tutor, but one that saved lives later. History began to settle into a more nuanced judgment. The delay was no longer seen simply as hesitation, but as calculated restraint shaped by experience rather than fear. The cost of waiting remained real, but so did the cost of rushing. Between those realities, Churchill had chosen the path he believed offered the least irreversible harm. Churchill's wartime leadership defied simple classification. He was neither infallible nor rigid. His strength lay in understanding uncertainty and refusing to let it dictate reckless action. The decision that shocked the Allies exemplified this trait more than any speech or battlefield visit. He had absorbed lessons from earlier failures without allowing them to paralyze him. Gallipoli had taught him caution but not surrender. The interwar years had taught him patience but not complacency. These experiences converged in the moment he redirected Allied strategy. Leadership, in this sense, was an act of synthesis. Churchill balanced political pressure, military reality, and historical memory, knowing that pleasing everyone was impossible. What mattered was survival and eventual victory. The alliance learned from this example. Later conflicts would echo the lesson that unity did not require uniformity of thought. Strong coalitions allowed space for dissent grounded in evidence and experience. Churchill's reputation, often reduced to defiant rhetoric, was more accurately defined by such moments of restraint. His refusal to rush became an expression of courage as profound as any battlefield stand. Uncertainty remained a constant companion, but it no longer dictated action. Instead, it informed preparation, shaping decisions that could withstand the unexpected. In this way, leadership proved to be less about certainty than about judgment under pressure, exercised without the comfort of hindsight. With the war drawing to a close, analysts and historians began revisiting the moments that had shaped its trajectory. Among them, Churchill's redirection of Allied strategy stood out as one of the most consequential. What had once seemed an evasion of confrontation was now understood as a deliberate shaping of it. The Allies had chosen not to avoid battle, but to choose the terms on which it would be fought. The North African campaign, once dismissed as a sideshow, emerged as foundational. It forged command relationships, exposed weaknesses, and created a shared operational language that would later prove decisive. Even critics conceded that the timing of the Normandy invasion owed much to the lessons learned elsewhere. The war's climactic moments had been prepared for far from the place where history would remember them. Churchill himself resisted triumphalism. He understood that decisions in war rarely age cleanly. Their value lies not in universal approval, but in outcomes achieved under uncertainty. The decision that had shocked the Allies no longer shocked history. It stood instead as an example of strategic patience exercised at a moment when impatience seemed irresistible. In reconsideration, it revealed its true nature, not a delay of victory but its careful construction. Long after the war ended, the echoes of that decision continued to shape military thought. Future planners studied it not as a formula to be copied, but as a reminder that context governs strategy. What worked once did so because it fit its moment. Churchill's legacy rested not only on words or resolve, but on choices made quietly, against pressure, and without certainty of validation. The shock he delivered to his allies was, in essence, a demand for patience in a world desperate for action. The alliance he helped lead emerged stronger for having endured disagreement. Its victory was not fragile or accidental, but the result of adaptation forced by uncomfortable debate. For the men who fought and the civilians who endured, the war remained a tapestry of suffering and sacrifice. Yet within that tapestry, the threads of preparation and restraint prevented even greater catastrophe. History rarely rewards those who wait, yet it often vindicates them. Churchill's decision belonged to that rare category where restraint altered destiny. The day he ordered a move that shocked the Allies did not delay victory. It reshaped it, strengthened it, and ensured it could be sustained. In the end, the shock was not the decision itself, but the wisdom behind it, revealed only when the war was won and the cost of haste could finally be measured.